The most profound and persistent mystery confronting human spirituality is not the existence of God, but the nature of God's existence. We live in the relentless, forward-moving stream of succession, marked by birth, decay, and the inescapable passage of the clock. We are creatures of before and after. But when we turn our gaze toward the divine, we must ask the central provocative question that has divided theologians for millennia. Does God experience a before and after like humanity, or is all of history, from the first moment of creation to the ultimate consummation, a single, simultaneous, and eternal now for the divine? This inquiry plunges us immediately into the heart of a paradox articulated most eloquently by St. Augustine of Hippo, whose reflections on the subject remain the bedrock of Western theological thought. Augustine confessed his frustration with the elusive nature of our most constant reality. What, then, is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to someone, I do not know. We intuitively grasp time, yet it dissolves under intellectual scrutiny. It is defined by its ceaseless flight. The past is gone, the future is not yet, and the present is merely the knife edge dividing the two, instantaneously vanishing the moment we attempt to grasp it. Theological tradition, wrestling with this human experience of temporality, has established two distinct and radically opposed foundational views regarding the divine relationship to time. The first is the classic view, divine timelessness or atemporality, exemplified by the Church Fathers and rooted deeply in Hellenistic philosophy and metaphysical necessity. This view posits that God exists entirely outside the temporal sequence. The second is the modern challenge, divine temporality or timefullness, found primarily in contemporary relational theologies, which argue that God is intimately involved in the unfolding drama of history and therefore must experience time sequentially, moment by moment, alongside creation. To understand the stakes of this debate, we must first immerse ourselves in the majestic, imposing vision of classical theology, beginning with St. Augustine and the argument for divine timelessness. Pillar 1. The classic argument for divine timelessness posits that God is not merely very old or infinitely long-lasting, but rather exists in a mode of being entirely distinct from duration. The premise begins simply, God is the creator of time. If God created the heavens and the earth, he must also have created the framework within which those heavens and earth operate, the framework of succession, change, and measurement. Time, therefore, is a created entity contingent upon God's will and is absolutely not a co-eternal reality existing alongside God. This premise immediately dismantles the ancient skeptical question that challenged Augustine. What was God doing before he made heaven and earth? Augustine's genius was to recognize that the question itself is fundamentally flawed and incoherent. If God created time with the act of creation, then there was no before in a temporal sense. To ask what God was doing before time existed is like asking what is north of the North Pole. It is a conceptual impossibility. God is intrinsically before all time, not because he occupied some infinite void preceding the universe, but because his existence transcends the very structure of succession. He is the supreme, never-ending present, the unmoving ground of all reality. For the classical theologian, eternity is not merely endless duration. It is not everlasting time. Everlasting time would mean that God is simply moving along an infinite timeline, experiencing one moment after another only without end. This, however, would still subject God to change, to succession, and to the loss of moments into the past. Eternity, properly understood in the Augustinian tradition, is the state of perfect static immediacy. This is the concept of the Nunc Stans, the standing now. The Nunc Stans signifies that for God, all events, the formation of the galaxies, the fall of Adam, the crucifixion of Christ, and the final judgment, are known and experienced in a single simultaneous moment. God does not need to recall the past. He does not have memory in the human sense, nor anticipate the future. He does not have expectation. His knowledge is complete, immediate, and perfectly unified. His years are but a day, and that day is not recurrent, but always today. His today is eternity. This concept is not meant to imply that God is unaware of the temporal sequence of events. Rather, he sees the entire film reel of history laid out at once, while we, the creatures, are stuck viewing it frame by frame. The biblical case for timelessness rests heavily upon the divine attributes of immutability and sovereignty. Scripture repeatedly asserts that God is unchanging, perfectly constant, and utterly reliable. James chapter 1 verse 17 states explicitly that God is the Father of lights, with whom there is no change or shifting shadow. If God were temporal, he would necessarily be mutable. He would change as he moved from one moment of experience to the next, learning new things, reacting to new events, and suffering the passage of time. A timeless God, however, is pure being, impervious to change, providing the necessary anchor for all contingent reality. Furthermore, God's absolute sovereignty, his ability to declare the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, Isaiah chapter 46 verses 9 and 10, is predicated upon his timeless knowledge. If God knows the future infallibly, it is because the future is already present to him. The analogy often used to convey this perspective is found in Psalm 90 verse 4. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. This verse is not merely minimizing the duration of human life. It is emphasizing the qualitative difference between divine and human experience of duration. To fully appreciate the weight of the classical position, we must return to Augustine's psychological theory of time, detailed powerfully in Book 11 of his Confessions. Augustine recognized that time is not a physical substance we can measure directly, but a profound mental reality. The past, he argued, only exists as memory, the future only exists as expectation, and the present, the moment we try to hold it, slips into the past. Time, therefore, exists only as a distension of the mind, or distentio animi. Our soul is stretched out, pulled between what was and what will be. We suffer succession, we endure change, and our very consciousness is defined by this temporal tension. This human condition of distentio animi serves as the perfect foil for the divine nature. Human existence is defined by change, succession, and the inherent anxiety of the unknown future and the regretted past. God's existence, conversely, is defined by unchangeable being, perfect unity, and the serenity of the eternal present. The timeless God is the refuge from our temporal fragmentation, the still point around which the turning world revolves. The Augustinian project is fundamentally a spiritual one, to understand the transcendent God in order to understand the fractured self. His theological inquiry into time was inseparable from his personal, agonizing journey toward faith, a journey marked by intellectual searching, moral struggle, and the wrestling with desire and memory. This very struggle, the attempt to reconcile the fleeting nature of human time with the permanent reality of the divine, is the core theme of his greatest work. If you are finding yourself wrestling with these deep questions of memory, desire, and the relentless pressure of time, and if you want to delve deeper into this struggle of the soul we are talking about, there is no better guide than the theological giant who defined this debate. I speak, of course, of the Confessions by St. Augustine of Hippo. This is not merely an ancient philosophical treatise. It is the fundamental spiritual autobiography that describes Augustine's personal path from paganism and Manichaeism to the profound depths of Christian faith. Reading. The Confessions allows you to witness firsthand the intellectual and emotional turmoil of one of history's greatest minds as he explores the themes of sin, grace, memory, and desire. It provides the essential context for understanding why his theological conclusions about God's timelessness were so critical to his own spiritual liberation, I have left a link to the book in the description so you can continue this journey alongside Augustine, allowing his deeply personal insights to illuminate your own path toward understanding the nature of your soul and its relationship to the eternal. And for those who prefer a more comfortable reading experience, this book is available in a large print edition, making it easier on the eyes to absorb these profound spiritual lessons. Having established the powerful, coherent, and historically dominant position of divine timelessness, the view of God as the utterly transcendent, immutable, and non-sequential being, we must now turn to the modern challenge. This critique emerged largely from a desire to emphasize God's intimate relationality, his responsiveness, and the genuine freedom of creation, often arguing that the classical model renders God too abstract, too distant, and too impersonal. Pillar 2. The modern argument for divine temporality begins with the challenge of divine relationality and freedom. The core critique levied against the timeless God is this: how can a God who experiences all things simultaneously genuinely interact with temporal beings? If God already knows every prayer, every response, and every future outcome as an eternal done deal, does his response to prayer possess any true meaning? Response implies change in experience. It implies moving from a state of not knowing or not acting to a state of knowing or acting. If God cannot change, critics argue, then his love, his grief, and his participation in history must be merely metaphorical or even illusory. The concept of a timeful God, therefore, asserts that God experiences time sequentially, moment by moment, in relation to creation. God is not timeless, but rather everlasting, existing within the temporal flow he created. He is always the greatest and most glorious reality in that flow, but he is nonetheless moving forward with the universe. This perspective seeks to make God maximally relational, maximally present, and genuinely responsive to the unfolding drama of human history. One of the most provocative contemporary movements challenging classical timelessness is open theism. Open theism proposes that God voluntarily limits his knowledge of the contingent future to allow for true libertarian human freedom. The thesis is straightforward. If God infallibly knows all future free choices, meaning he knows with absolute certainty what you will choose 10 years from now, then those choices are not truly free in the sense that you could have chosen otherwise. The certainty of God's knowledge seems to necessitate the inevitability of the event. To preserve the radical freedom of the human agent, open theism argues that the future is genuinely open, even to God. God knows all possibilities, all probabilities, and all present realities, but he does not possess exhaustive, settled knowledge of future free actions because, as they argue, such knowledge is logically impossible if those actions are truly free. This theological implication paints God as a risk-taking collaborator, a cosmic strategist who is genuinely surprised by and open to new experiences and outcomes as history unfolds. God is active, dynamic, and constantly adjusting his plans in response to the free choices of his creatures. The proponents of divine temporality root their case heavily in the biblical narrative, arguing that many passages describing God's emotional change and apparent learning should be taken literally, not merely as anthropomorphism, ascribing human qualities to God for the sake of human understanding. Consider the profound, troubling passage in Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, where, seeing the wickedness of humanity, the text says that the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. If God is timeless and immutable, how can he regret anything? Regret implies a change in emotional state, a change in judgment, and a movement from satisfaction to sorrow. If classical theology insists that God merely appears to regret, but is eternally and serenely unchanged, then the emotional force of the divine interaction seems diminished, stripped of its genuine pathos. Similarly, the narrative of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac provides another critical piece of evidence for the temporally minded theologian. After Abraham proves his obedience, the angel of the Lord calls out, saying, "Do not lay your hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your Son, your only Son, from me. Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. The phrase, "now I know," is interpreted not as God merely testing Abraham for Abraham's benefit, but as God genuinely coming to a new piece of knowledge, contingent upon a free human action. The act of obedience was a genuine revelation to God, something he experienced in the sequence of time. For the advocates of temporality, these passages are not stylistic flourishes. They are literal descriptions of a mutable divine experience, demonstrating a God who is passionately involved and genuinely affected by the choices of his creation. This view grants tremendous weight and significance to human action and prayer. A related and even more radical expression of divine temporality is found in process theology, which draws heavily upon the philosophical work of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne. Process theology rejects the entire classical framework of a static, perfect, unchanging substance. For process thinkers, reality is not defined by static substance, but by dynamic process. Everything is fundamentally relational, changing, and in flux. When applied to God, this results in the concept of the dipolar God. Process theology posits that God has two poles to his nature. First, the unchanging abstract pole, often called the primordial nature, which consists of God's eternal essence, his abstract goodness, and his unchanging aims for the world. This pole is eternal and immutable. Second, God has a changing concrete pole, the consequent nature, which is God's actual moment-by-moment experience of the universe. The consequent nature of God is constantly changing because it takes in, or prehends, every event that occurs in the cosmos. Every act of human love, every moment of suffering, every choice and every natural process is incorporated into God's own being, enriching or diminishing his current state of actuality. This means God is not merely aware of the world, he is actually affected by the world. This leads to the conclusion that God is passible, meaning he can suffer and be affected, and mutable in his experience. He is the supreme fellow sufferer, the one who participates fully in the joy and the agony of creation. While classical theology sought to protect God's perfection by placing him outside time and change, process theology finds God's perfection precisely in his ability to relate, to change, and to fully participate in the temporal process. The dipolar God is the ultimate example of timefullness, where creation and creator are bound together in a mutual, dynamic, and ever-developing relationship. The contrast between these two pillars could not be starker. On one side, we have the majestic, timeless, immutable God of classical theology, who guarantees the ultimate coherence and sovereignty of the universe by standing outside the flow of succession. On the other, we have the dynamic, temporal, relational God of modern theology, who guarantees genuine freedom and responsive love by participating fully within the flow of succession. This theological tension brings us to our conclusion: the unresolved tension and its spiritual significance. We have summarized the two profound conceptions of the divine. Timelessness, championed by Augustine and the classical tradition, sees God as the unchangeable, sovereign ground of all reality, guaranteeing ultimate purpose and providing an absolute foundation of truth and goodness that cannot be shaken by the vicissitudes of time. Temporality, championed by open theism and process theology, sees God as the dynamic, relational partner, guaranteeing genuine freedom, responsive love, and the real significance of every moment. Neither view is without its intellectual cost. The timeless God risks abstraction, difficulty in explaining genuine prayer, and the challenge of reconciling absolute foreknowledge with true human freedom. The temporal God risks mutability, vulnerability, and potentially compromising the ultimate sovereignty and perfect knowledge traditionally ascribed to the divine. The believer, therefore, is left to navigate this spiritual paradox. The spiritual implication for the believer shifts dramatically depending on which conception we embrace. If God is timeless, our comfort lies in his absolute consistency and the certainty of his plan. We are reassured that even in the midst of chaos, God sees our entire life, our past mistakes, our present suffering, and our future triumph from the perspective of his eternal today. Our hope is fixed on an unmoving, perfect reality that exists beyond the reach of entropy and decay. This view promotes profound reverence and trust in divine providence, encouraging us to seek stillness and eternity within our temporal lives. If God is temporal, our hope lies in his active moment-by-moment presence. We are comforted by the knowledge that our free choices, our genuine struggles, and our heartfelt prayers genuinely affect his experience in the unfolding narrative of the world. This view promotes passionate engagement, co-creation, and the conviction that our actions hold real, sequential weight in the divine-human relationship. The ultimate mystery remains. Can we conceive of a reality that perfectly synthesizes the changeless being of eternity with the radical relationality of time? Perhaps the truth lies in a paradox that our finite minds cannot fully resolve. A God who is simultaneously the ground of being that transcends all time, and the Word made flesh, who entered fully into the temporal, fragile, and suffering reality of human history. The doctrine of the Incarnation, where the timeless Word took on flesh and lived, suffered and died in a specific historical moment, serves as the ultimate bridge between these two concepts. Christ is the eternal today that stepped into our fleeting yesterday and tomorrow. Ultimately, the question of God's nature in relation to time remains the highest object of human philosophical and theological inquiry. It forces us to confront our own existence, our own limitations, and the vast, incomprehensible majesty of the divine. In the face of this profound mystery, the most critical response is not merely intellectual assent to a doctrine, but the practical cultivation of a spiritual life that seeks union with the eternal, regardless of how we define his relationship to the clock. The tension between the timeless and the timeful God, between the immutable and the relational, is a tension that defines the intellectual landscape of faith. Yet for the individual soul, the path to God is often simpler than the complex theological definitions we construct. The goal is not to perfectly define the divine nature, but to perfectly imitate the divine life. If the intellectual struggle leaves us feeling overwhelmed by the vastness of the mystery, we must anchor ourselves in the practicalities of piety and humility. The ultimate challenge presented by the nature of time is not to solve God, but to recognize the incomprehensible breadth of his being, a being whose existence encompasses both the eternal stillness of the Nunc Stans and the radical responsive love that enters into every fleeting moment of our fragile temporal lives.